interest rates again for the second time in a row. Except this time, it's not just a one-off move to stabilize the economy. Instead, this could be the beginning of a full-on rate cut cycle, and if history repeats itself, there's no going back. After all, the last time we saw a move like this, it triggered a chain reaction that sent asset prices spiraling, debt surging out of control, and liquidity flooding out of every corner of the market. So with the money printer officially turning back on, let's talk about exactly what just happened, Jerome Powell's latest warning, the impact this is about to have on all things money, and then most importantly, how you could use this information to profit, because trust me, this is definitely not the time you want to be left behind. Although before we start, as usual, if you appreciate the last-minute breaking news videos like this, it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button or subscribed if you haven't done that already. Yes, I get tired of asking, but it does help tremendously, and as a thank you for doing that, here's a picture of a mantis shrimp. So thanks so much, and also big thank you to Helium Mobile for sponsoring this video, but more on that later. Alright, so in terms of why we're quickly beginning to lower interest rates, despite stocks, cryptocurrency, gold, and real estate trading near their all-time highs, let's start with the government shutdown. So here's the thing, at the core, the Federal Reserve's entire goal is to maintain maximum levels of employment, make sure as many people have a job as possible, and preferably be able to do all of that without inflation skyrocketing out of control. Except this time, the government shutdown has lasted way longer than expected. More than 1 million federal workers have been furloughed, and with a lot of national data being delayed, it's becoming clearer that the United States economy is slowing down a lot faster than expected. For instance, Bank of America recently found that small business hiring fell by 7%, and even Jerome Powell recently admitted that both supply and demand in the labor market have come down so sharply, so quickly. Or I guess put another way, since the government shutdown delayed some very critical employment and economic reports, some for the first time in 12 years, the Federal Reserve is using alternative data to help guide how much and how fast they lower interest rates. And those reports are overwhelmingly showing that unemployment is increasing, layoffs are becoming more common, and lower rates might help stabilize the economy. Although in terms of the rest of the markets and how this is likely to affect your money directly, here's where things get very interesting. The stock market. Look, on the surface, despite every pessimistic headline, objectively, the S&P 500 has done incredibly well in 2025. I mean, let's face it, we're up more than 30% from the April lows, and over the last 5 years, we've pretty much doubled in price, which is essentially the equivalent of getting a 15% annualized return every single year. But in terms of whether or not this is sustainable, here's what I didn't expect. Both Bank of America and Morgan Stanley now predict that we could see another 8% increase throughout 2026, bringing the S&P 500 to a whopping 7,200. Why? Well, as they say, corporations will continue earning a lot of money, AI will broaden throughout the rest of the market, and productivity will increase. However, others have pointed out that above-trend growth like this usually isn't sustainable, and that long-term, we'll see smaller returns as the market begins to balance out. For Goldman Sachs, this translates to just a 3% annualized return over the next 10 years, compared to JPMorgan, who previously predicted that we'll see a 6% annualized return. Of course, not everyone agrees with this, with DataTrek saying that while the stock market has endured decade-long stretches of 3% returns, those tend to follow very specific catalysts such as the Great Depression, the 1973-4 oil shock, or the 2008 financial crisis. But hey, you know what, at this point, I just believe that anything can happen, like the recent surge of leveraged ETFs that are pushing the market even higher because it's on borrowed money. That's why it is very important to recognize that 15 to 20% annualized returns are not normal. They do not keep happening indefinitely. And there is a chance for the next decade that we do see smaller returns than most people expect. Although historically, when the Fed does cut interest rates, when the market is within 3% of its all-time high, it is shown that the broader market trended higher by an average of 13%, 12 months later, with 93% of periods producing positive returns. But even though that sounds really good, there is a bit of a catch, because usually when the markets do trend higher, that also comes with a lot more volatility, with the strong...
We also have these charts here that show that market crashes don't typically happen until a year after the Fed cuts rates, saying that the last 3 times the Fed cut interest rates over the last 20 years coincided with the largest market crashes during that period. Although even though that sounds very ominous for the future, future, the reality is that market crashes don't just happen because the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, but instead it's because of the conditions that caused the Fed to lower interest rates in the first place. And that is something to keep in mind. This is why I think that we should expect the best but prepare for the worst. And even though a lot of experts are quite bullish for the near future, going as so far to say that we could see a 13% return, for me, I'm basing my long-term projections on probably earning 4 to 6% a year. If it does better than that, great. And if it does worse, well, I'm not letting that influence my future decisions. Although in terms of how this impacts the housing market and the rest of your portfolio, here's where things get crazy. Although before we go into that, with prices rising across everything from rent to groceries to utilities, it feels like your money just isn't going as far as it used to, especially heading into the holidays. That is why it is so important to find ways to cut back without feeling like you're missing out. And one of the easiest overlooked expenses that people have no idea about is their phone bill. For instance, the average person is spending over $100 a month, but you could be paying nothing thanks to Helium Mobile, who I'd like to thank for sponsoring this video because they're a genuinely incredible service. For those unaware, their plans start at just $0 a month, as in totally free with no contract, no credit card, and no hidden fees. It's perfect for light users or those who want a second line. Or if you want unlimited data, that is just $30 a month, again, with no contracts whatsoever. Not to mention, if you have kids, they also have a plan for them that's only $5 a month that comes with 3 gigabytes of data and unlimited texts and calls, while you stay in full control. On top of that, Helium Mobile also pays you back in cloud points for doing simple things like referring friends or actively using your cellular data. And those points could be redeemed for gift cards to places like Amazon, Apple, Sephora, and more, all from within the Helium Mobile app. This means you could finally budget for the holidays without overpaying for your cell phone plan. And all you have to do to get started is sign up for Helium Mobile down below in the description and use the code GRAHAM to get $10 in cloud points for gift cards just for signing up. Again, the link is down below to start saving today. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the video. All right, so in terms of what the Federal Reserve just said, what's going on with your money, and what's happening with the rest of the market, let's start with housing prices. Now, when it comes to this, let's get some of the good news out of the way first. With more inventory coming on the market, home sales are expected to increase by 10% in 2026. This means more new listings, more activity, and more turnover between buyers and sellers as mortgage rates begin to trend back down. On top of that, in terms of national prices, we are starting to see home values beginning to fall. Like S&P Global found that the real estate market decreased by 0.1% month over month and 1.7% year over year. Of course, then, if you adjust that for inflation, it's really more like an annualized drop of 2.3%. However, even though prices are slightly falling, it's still true that more than 30% of buyers are purchasing their home in cash, and now the average down payment has risen to its highest level ever recorded at $70,000. Although in terms of the price predictions for the future, here's where things get very interesting. Overall, Realtor.com found that most price reductions take place in the $350,000 to $500,000 price point, and that luxury homes are the least likely to see a price cut, with the top of the market simply waiting it out for the right person to come along. In fact, Redfin noted that buyers now are more likely to begin testing the market and throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks, and as a result, roughly 15% of deals are now falling through, with home inspections being the #1 roadblock. Although even with all this information, I will say anecdotally, I just sold my own house in Los Angeles, and even though I'll be posting a video about this in the next few weeks, the market is still very active. If you price your listing appropriately, you have the right strategy, and you make it look as best as possible. Like for me, I saw the market beginning to soften in Los Angeles, and so I priced my home aggressively. As a result of that, I ended up getting multiple offers over asking, several of them cash, and within about 2 weeks, it was done. Now obviously, that could have gone completely differently had I priced my listing too high, waited for buyers to come around, and then chased the market down, which is all too common right now. I just see so many sellers asking ridiculous prices only because they can. I don't know what they expect to get from this, because buyers aren't dumb. They see you bought the home 4 years ago for $800,000, and just because you list it today at $1.5 million doesn't mean you're gonna get it. That's why I think if you're a buyer, don't be afraid to take your time, and if you're a seller, you need to be realistic about the home's value, and if you are, homes are still moving pretty quickly. But in terms of the rest of the market and what Jerome Powell just said, here's what you came for. Like I mentioned earlier, as of a few hours ago, the Federal Reserve officially lowered interest rates by another 25 basis points, marking the second rate cut in a row, with surprisingly more on the way. In fact, it's now expected that we could see another 25 to 50 basis point rate cut occurring as soon as December 10th, with even more occurring throughout 2026. Why? Well, we largely still have a lot of economic uncertainty. Companies are hiring less. AI could lead to even more job cuts. And now that inflation from tariffs seems a lot less likely today than it did 6 months ago, the Fed can move forward with cutting rates without worrying as much about inflation coming back. On top of that, it's also important to realize that Jerome Powell's existing term ends in May of 2026. So theoretically, once he's out, Trump would be able to appoint one of his own people as the head of the chair, which means he would have a lot more influence to realistically lower interest rates even further throughout the end of next year. But in terms of what's happening today, beyond the rate cut, it appears as though they are very closely monitoring the recent banking crisis. They've acknowledged that the downside risks to employment are increasing. And most importantly, this is the biggest one. They've indicated the potential end of quantitative tightening. Or in other words, if that sounds confusing, here's a very simple example, because you need to understand how this works. Imagine our economy is like a swimming pool. Well, when shit hits the fan, the Fed fills it up with lots of water so that everyone has enough to swim around in. But over time, that water evaporates and needs to be topped off. Well, quantitative tightening is when the Fed doesn't top off the pool for evaporation and simply lets the water level decline on its own. Well, in this case, for the last few years, the Fed has purposely chosen not to top off our economy, instead just letting things dry up on their own. But now they might begin to top it off for inflation in the near future, and this could suggest that the money printer is beginning to turn back on. So what does this mean for you, your money in the future, and how can you make money off of it? In terms of what I think, honestly, a lot of this was to be expected, and the market was pricing in these rate cuts for the last few weeks. In fact, the market is still pricing in another 25 basis point rate cut, minimum, again in December. So it's clear that the Fed sees an employment slowdown on the horizon, and it's important that they get ahead of this early before things get worse. However, there are still a lot of other people worried that the Fed is cutting interest rates during a time when stocks are trading near all-time highs, gold is trading near an all-time high, Bitcoin is trading near an all-time high, and the US dollar is plummeting in value, which is concerning to people who are worried about too much money entering the economy at a time where everything is already very expensive. Well, I tend to think, on the one hand, if we truly don't have more inflation coming soon, then lowering interest rates is going to help stabilize the labor market, and it's going to cause more businesses to hopefully hire more people and help keep our economy doing well. Or I guess it could also just cause everything to skyrocket back to the moon. I guess I just think that if the Fed is cutting interest rates, they understand that the economy is fragile, and they're just hoping that they could get ahead of any potential issues by easing monetary policy now. This is why we've seen gold jump up so quickly. It's why more investors are buying safe havens like bonds. And it's why we still have $7 trillion worth of cash sitting on the sidelines. So in terms of what I'm doing about this, I'm going to be a broken record for the millionth time and just say that I have about 20% of my money in cash earning 4.2%, tax-free with muni bonds. I continue to buy the S&P 500, emerging markets, and international markets on a regular basis. And I'm allocating a small amount to a Bitcoin ETF that I just buy on a regular basis. When the market drops, I buy more. When the market goes up, I also buy more. Is it boring? Yes. Is it consistent? Yes. Is it statistically likely to have the highest returns over the next 10 to 20 years? Yes. That's why if you've made it to this part of the video, please let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments, because I will be at my computer for the next few hours reading and responding to as many of you as I can. So thank you again so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and until next time. Potential for 15 to 20% swings to the downside should the market decide to sell off. On top of that,